So, did I get it wrong, or did the judge get it wrong? What am I talking about? Well, you may have seen that Huw Edwards was sentenced yesterday over those inappropriate pictures, to put it mildly, for the algorithm. And I was prepared to do my mystic albit and, sort of go, ooh, I predicted this, but I got it wrong. And why did I get it wrong? Well, I predicted that he would get around 200 hours community service. I mean, I knew he wasn't going inside, but he got a suspended sentence instead, and that's pretty much it. So what I thought I'd like to do is talk about why I came to that conclusion, discuss what the judge did and what factors the judge took into account, and then talk about the sentencing guidelines, because the question is, first of all, did the judge follow the sentencing guidelines? Spoiler, yeah, pretty much. But then the other question is, are those sentencing guidelines correct? Do the punishments that they suggest reflect the severity of the crime? And also, just how do sentencing guidelines come into effect anyway? Who issues these guidelines? So, what was I surprised about? Generally speaking, when it comes to sentencing people, we say there are sort of a number of factors as to why we have the criminal law, why we have sentencing. And the idea is that's individual deterrence. We punish somebody so they themselves don't want to commit the offence again. There's also general deterrence. People see that if you do this, you go to prison or you receive some other punishment, and that should deter people generally. Although there's quite a lot of research on this, and it seems to be that for most crimes, it's not the actual length of the sentence that's the deterrent, it's the probability of actually being caught. I mean, that does vary, and people have said it's different for sort of acquisitive offences like theft as opposed to sort of violent and SUL offences like this. The psychology is quite interesting. There's also, the rehabilitation element. The idea is that it's in the public interest that we stop people committing crime again, whether that's by means of special courses or therapy or just showing them the error of their ways, letting them reflect. There's also just public protection. We lock some people up just because they're too dangerous to be let loose in public. And the final element is the punishment element. We wish to mark that, by some sentence, that this is behaviour we don't approve of. And also there's this idea of what we call the social balance sheet. You do something wrong, therefore you owe society. Because remember, in criminal law, it's the state against the defendant, the victims. They're not a party to the case. Although I think it's very important to remember, these are not victimless crimes. There are the children in these photographs. They reflect absolutely terrible, trauma and torture and, abuse. So, we need to sort of mark that and say, you owe something back. I mean, this comes in when we do mitigation. This is why people will say things in mitigation like, apart from the crime, he helps out in the community, he does all this, he's been a good person generally, he's done lots of charity work. The idea being on the social balance sheet, that's certain things to your credit, and therefore that can be taken into account. But what I'm really surprised about here is, there isn't really any punitive element to it in this suspended sentence. Now, the judge recognised this, and it's a very good judgment. The sentencing remarks are very comprehensive. And the judge identified those factors. But what's interesting is the judge said that, there needs to be punishment. We need to reflect this. Now, interesting, the Sentencing Council, they have an interesting thing where they put out sort of sentencing myths. And one of the sentencing myths that they address is they say that when people get a non-custodial, quotes, they walk free from court. They've got away scot-free. And the argument is, well, no, because usually a non-custodial sentence still has a punitive element. But in this particular case, I just can't see what the punitive element is. I mean, the judge recognised the need for it, but he acknowledged that, Edwards' career is, quotes, in tatters, and that he has suffered enormously. But he said, that's not a punishment, that is just a consequence of your actions. So the judge said, I'm not taking into account everything that's happened to you because you brought that on yourself. And I think that's fair enough. But then he said, a non-custodial sentence can still be punitive. And yes, it can, but the whole point of custody is the punishment is the deprivation of liberty. That's it. It's not, you will have a horrible time in prison or you will suffer, because, people convicted of these sorts of offences do not do very well in prison. But the idea is it's just the deprivation of liberty. And that's why we have minor things like, you can be put on a curfew order where you can't go out sort of, in the evening and things like that. And the idea is the punishment there is, again, it's the deprivation of liberty. You're not allowed to do everything you'd want to do. But what is the punitive element here? Well, there just isn't one. Now, the thing with a suspended sentence is that normally it's like, okay, you've got the suspended sentence because this has crossed the custody threshold. We think this is so serious that only a custodial sentence can address the offending. However, we're going to suspend it. I mean, what are the factors for suspending a sentence? It's a realistic prospect of rehabilitation. It's strong personal mitigation, and also it's the effect on innocent third parties that an immediate custodial sentence might have. I mean, that only really kicks in, sort of, if it's a single mum and she's up for shoplifting or something like that, and what's going to happen to her children, if they all have to go into care. It's that sort of thing. But what factors apply here? Well, they've done it on the sort of strong personal mitigation aspect. Oh well, you were suffering from mental difficulties, and I accept. I mean, the judge said, I accept you didn't even realise you'd done this, which I find a little bit sceptical. And also, as I've said before, I don't normally give my opinions, but I am not a big fan of people using mental health issues in mitigation, because A, that just stigmatises people with mental health issues. Lots of people have had trauma and horrible lives and abusive parents and struggle with mental health issues, but they don't go out and commit offences. I mean, statistically, people with mental health issues actually commit offences at a lower rate. They're more likely to be the victims of crime. And I also don't just like the fact that, it just gets people off for no reason. So it stigmatises people with legit mental health, and also it's put forward as an excuse, and I just don't think often it is an excuse. I mean, don't get me wrong, I've spoken before about, diminished responsibility and insanity and things like that. Well, fine, yeah, some people legit don't know what they're doing. Or they do struggle, with knowing right from wrong. But I don't think anybody's suggesting Huw Edwards doesn't know right from wrong. So I have to say, I did find that a bit strange. But yeah, it's the fact that when you get a suspended sentence, the court sort of recognise that you are getting away a bit scot-free. So they'll usually impose something like, community service at the same time. So it's like, okay, your sentence is suspended. And the thing to remember about suspended sentences is, it's if you commit another offence within the period of the suspension, which is up to 2 years, this is 6 months sentence suspended for 2 years, then generally speaking, the sentence has to be activated in full. Although there are guidance like that, if you got done for like no MOT, they probably wouldn't haul you back inside. But that's the general thing. It's like, you are walking on a tightrope here. You should be looking over your shoulder and making sure you behave. But normally they'd put something in lieu such as, community penalty. And the pre-sentence report specifically said, it said Mr. Edwards is capable of fulfilling a community service order. So it's not like, well, I was going to give you community service, but for whatever reason, your physical or mental health means that, that would not be appropriate, wouldn't be able to do it. In this particular case, they said, no, he's perfectly suitable to do community service. And that's what I'm surprised about, that there wasn't at least an element of, you need to put something back. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm a big fan of restorative justice, especially for young people. I mean, this is a rather weird thing that with young offenders, that the best way to stop a young offender becoming an old offender is not to catch them, seriously, because most people grow out of crime, because they're just young idiots, and they finally get a girlfriend or something like that, or a steady job, and, they suddenly realise that they need to grow up. Whereas once people in the criminal justice system, they tend to stay in it. So I don't have a problem, if you do a bit of minor vandalism, well, a letter of apology to the person and go around and, do a few weeks tidying up their garden or decorating for them or something like that, that's fine. I mean, and I've seen some real success stories with that, where young idiots, effectively, they've had to face their victims. And the victims, because, they don't have to agree to restorative justice. It's very victim-focused. They can say, no, I don't want to speak to them. Just do what you want with them. But sometimes they will sit down and say, look, I want you to understand what you did to me. And a lot of the time when people realise that and see a human face to their offending, it can suddenly change them. It really can. I mean, I've always thought there'd be a really good plot for a movie that, you know, some young kid vandalises some old pensioners thing and does restorative justice, and they suddenly become really good friends. And then they realise that actually the young crim can be a decoy because nobody's going to suspect a pensioner when they go in and rob a bank. You know, so feel free to steal that idea. But, you know, like I say, I don't have a problem with that, but how do you restore? How do you make it up to the victims in an offence like this? Because, you know, even finding the victims is a nightmare. And I speak to judges who do a lot of this work, and they say the worst thing about this is that they recognise the children. They see the same children again and again, and they see them getting older, so they know that somewhere they are trapped in this. And that's why, you know, these offences, you know, are, or at least should be, taken very seriously. So like I say, I am very surprised that there's no sort of, you know, punitive element here. I mean, you know, like I say, you know, how do you make it right? Obviously, it doesn't, you know, just penalising somebody doesn't make it better for the victims. But somehow on the social thing, at least it expresses that, you know, there should be a price to pay if you do this sort of thing. As to the sentencing guidelines, I mean, like I say, I think the judge did fall within the sentencing guidelines. I mean, another thing that's interesting is, I sort of said in my previous video, there may be what we call a sexual harm prevention order. And that's something like, you know, okay, we're not going to send you to prison, or we are going to send you to prison, but even when you come out, there are certain things we need you to do or not to do. And that can be things like not have access to electronic devices, not have access to WhatsApp, not have unfettered access to the internet. And the judge did consider making such an order, and indeed the probation services recommended it. But for some reason the judge said, I don't think it's necessary in this case. I mean, the judge seems to be saying, okay, you have rehabilitated yourself, you have ticked all the boxes, therefore the rehabilitation element, we don't need to address it any further. I trust that you're not going to do this. And like I say, I don't think Edwards is getting any special treatment particularly. This, you know, this is not a sentence that's, you know, in any way sort of unusual, like I say, apart from the lack of the punitive element. But the sentencing guidelines, who actually makes those? Well, it's the Sentencing Council. And they consult, like, you know, experts in all sorts of areas like penal policy, sociology, crime. But also the public can make, you know, they can contribute as well. And now, a lot of people probably don't even know that. Interestingly, there was a consultation quite recently, because I've got a matter, there's a potential blackmail matter. So I was just looking at the sentencing guidelines for blackmail, and there aren't any. However, last year they actually did a consultation and they said, this is what we think the sentences should be for blackmail, but if you've got any opinion, feel free to chip in. So this is the idea that theoretically, they can turn around and say, well, sentencing is just, you know, we involve the public, so the public can't complain about the sentencing because they get a say in it. But how many people actually know that you can make representations to the Sentencing Council as to what you think sentences are? So yeah, in this particular case, I think it's right to say that, you know, the judgment was, quote, reasonable. I mean, it would not be appealable. I mean, it's not appealable anyway. But, you know, you get this unduly lenient sort of idea. I don't think it's unduly lenient. It just is a lenient sentence. I mean, I do think Edwards has got off lightly. And notwithstanding, I'm sure his life is ruined, but the mere fact that you had a lot to start with and that's all gone, it's all, you know, he's the author of his own misfortune. And I think there's a danger in saying, well, you've had this great, wonderful life and you were well respected and you've lost that. Because does that imply that if somebody isn't famous and isn't rich and isn't a celebrity, that actually, well, you know, it doesn't matter, your life was already terrible, so we can just throw the book at you because it doesn't make any difference. Now, I appreciate I'm being a lot more forthright and opinionated than I normally am on these things. But yeah, like I said, I just found the decision, like I say, surprising. So yeah, so my mystical thing, I mean, actually it specifically said, I said, I don't think this is, you know, I don't think it'll be a suspended sentence, because when you look at those factors, I mean, you know, has he got very strong personal mitigation? I don't think he has. You know, is there an effect on other people? Well, I'm sure his family are suffering, but you know, if he was inside, it's not like they're going to be thrown out and turfed out on the street. And is there a strong prospect of rehabilitation? Well, the judge is saying, yeah, okay, we've already got the rehabilitation. But that doesn't negate. I mean, lots of people go to prison because, you know, the only way the police found out about it is they come and confess and they say, look, I've learned the errors of my way. I want to get this off my chest. And they are clearly rehabilitated and they're clearly no risk to, you know, of further offending, but they still get sent to prison. So, yeah, I'm a bit surprised. But I'd be very interested in your thoughts and comments on all this. So, you know, please let me know in the comments what you think, and if there's anything specifically you want me to address about that. But there you go. So, who got it wrong, me or the judge? Well, I think I got it wrong, but hopefully I've explained why that was. So anyway, as always, hope you found that vaguely useful, vaguely interesting, vaguely informative. Reasonably accurate this time, because obviously this is a very serious subject, so I did actually, unusually for me, gather my thoughts before I started rambling. And where am I today? I'm just up at Tresillian again, the head of the Truro River, just because it seemed a nice, convenient spot to come and talk about this horrible and sordid subject.